The golden pen rolled all the way to the edge of the mahogany table before Isabella even touched the divorce papers, and Liam Montgomery did not move a single finger to stop it from falling. The metallic clatter on the marble floor somehow sounded much louder than the elegant classical music drifting in from the grand hall where his family was already toasting to the new era of Montgomery Global, acting as if the woman sitting across from him were already dead and buried. "Just sign it, Isabella. Let us finish this tonight with some shred of dignity." Liam said, his voice incredibly low, rigid, and his dark eyes completely devoid of the slightest tremor. Catherine, sitting rigidly near the towering window overlooking the New York skyline, adjusted her heavy emerald necklace and muttered under her breath that dignity was something Isabella had completely lost the moment she believed she could ever belong to their prestigious family. Rachel Alden smiled with a perfectly rehearsed fake pity, gently touching Liam's tailored sleeve, as she whispered that he had been far too generous with his soon-to-be ex-wife. Isabella silently read the strict confidentiality clause that permanently forbade her from ever publicly mentioning their marriage, as if 3 entire years of a shared life could be completely erased with a single stroke of ink. Then she slowly raised her face, looking far too calm for someone who was actively being expelled from her own home. "Are you absolutely sure that you want to lose everything tonight, Liam?" she asked, and for the very first time, he blinked rapidly, as if a sudden crack had violently fractured his absolute certainty. Liam tightened his jaw profoundly, bothered not by the subtle threat, but by her unshakable serenity, because Isabella had always possessed that rare ability to speak very little while striking exactly where it hurt the most, as if she could see the invisible numbers behind people, the hidden risks beneath their smiles, and the ugly lies carefully wrapped in expensive perfume. "Do not turn this into a cheap theatrical performance," he sharply replied, leaning down to retrieve the fallen pen from the floor and placing it deliberately back in front of her. "The theater truly began the moment you invited your future bride to sit here and watch the end of our marriage," Isabella calmly stated, completely refusing to even glance in Rachel's direction. The heavy silence that followed made even the distant party music feel profoundly indecent and entirely inappropriate for the room. Rachel let out a short, beautiful, and utterly venomous laugh, leaning over the table like a benevolent queen, offering unsolicited advice to a particularly rebellious maidservant. "Future bride is a very strong phrase, so let us just say that I am merely here to help Liam return to his rightful place in society." Catherine enthusiastically approved of this sentiment with a slight nod of her head, but Liam did not smile at all. He kept staring at Isabella, desperately searching for the barefoot woman he had met in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, making his coffee before a brutal meeting, only to find a dangerously calm stranger. The finalized divorce contract was exceedingly cold, perfectly clean, and almost ruthlessly elegant, because Liam had aggressively ordered his legal team to prepare everything to be executed as fast as humanly possible. It featured minimal asset division, absolute confidentiality, a complete waiver of any future corporate participation, and a financial compensation generous enough to silence any potential tabloid gossip. For him, this document represented absolute justice. For Catherine, it was a tragic waste of money for Rachel. It was an early victory, but for Isabella, it was simply the final proof that no one in that massive penthouse had ever understood why she had stayed. "I absolutely do not want your money," she said quietly, using the tips of her fingers to firmly push the compensation clause to the side of the table. Liam let out a joyless, hollow laugh, stating that everybody in this world always wants something from him, especially Isabella. She deeply felt the cruel phrase pierce through her ancient wounds, Not because it was a new accusation, but because it finally confirmed the terrible suspicion she had fiercely fought for 3 years to deny. "I only ever wanted you to truly see me," she responded, and her words were so profoundly simple that Liam's hand rapidly clenched into a tight fist over the table, revealing a hidden anger and a fragile ancient pain buried beneath his tailored suits and cruel decisions. Catherine abruptly interrupted the heavy moment before her son could yield to any weakness, demanding an end to the sentimental nonsense, and ordering Isabella to sign the papers and leave through the front door while she still had the chance. Isabella picked up the heavy pen, remembering for a fleeting moment the very first dinner in that exact same penthouse, when Liam proudly introduced her as his wife, and everyone smiled with the trained delicacy of people already calculating how many months she would last. She had arrived wearing a simple, unbranded dress, without a single piece of jewelry, having deliberately omitted her maternal surname, and she had instantly seen the mercenary judgment flashing in Catherine's cold eyes. "You really do not need to do this right in front of them," Isabella whispered, making one final desperate attempt to save a tiny fraction of his humanity. Liam averted his dark eyes for a single agonizing second that almost destroyed her soul, before replying that he absolutely needed to do it this way to be entirely sure that their story was permanently over. Isabella signed the first page, then the second page, and finally the third page, her hand never trembling once, while each letter of her name seemed to loudly strike the marble, echoing like a massive iron door permanently slamming shut. Isabella Montgomery ceased to exist in that quiet room, and when she finished, she placed the pen down with a delicate cruelty, announcing that he was now completely free. Rachel immediately stood up, looking far too victorious to fake any humility, praising Liam for doing the right thing, while Isabella gracefully stood up in her quiet navy blue dress. As she passed her former mother-in-law, Catherine, muttered about her finally having the good sense to avoid a scandal, prompting Isabella to stop, turn around, and softly declare that a scandal never begins when the truth appears, but rather when someone arrogantly believes they can bury it. At exactly 17 minutes past 8 o'clock the following morning, before Liam Montgomery could even finish his very first cup of coffee, 3 major banks abruptly demanded an immediate review of the financial guarantees backing Montgomery Global. The catastrophic news dropped into the massive glass boardroom on Wall Street like a heavy stone violently shattering a thin sheet of glass. Powerful men who were deeply accustomed to shouting orders began frantically shuffling through their manila folders without daring to make eye contact with one another. The chief financial officer, Aaron Norton, grew deathly pale as he stared at the glowing monitor where the terrifying red lines of plunging metrics multiplied by the second. "This is completely abnormal and highly aggressive," Aaron whispered, his voice far too low for a corporate meeting of that massive magnitude. Liam heavily planted both of his hands on the polished table and glared intensely at the falling numbers, as if he could physically force them to obey his will. He demanded an immediate explanation, and Aaron swallowed hard, explaining that a mysterious private fund that had quietly purchased a massive portion of their corporate debt was now aggressively demanding access to their protective clauses. Liam felt a deeply uncomfortable chill rapidly crawl up the back of his neck as he asked for the exact name of the entity causing this unprecedented chaos. "Atlantic 5, a holdings," Aaron finally replied. And while the name meant absolutely nothing to the majority of the executives, 2 older board members exchanged a very quick, terrified glance that Liam immediately noticed. When Liam demanded to know who these people were, Aaron hesitated before explaining that they were shadow players who normally never showed their faces. And when they finally did appear, it meant that someone else had already completely lost control of the situation. Just yesterday, Liam had foolishly believed that Isabella's signature would permanently end his era of instability and pave a golden road for the massive merger with Alden Capital. Now, every single new email pinging in the room seemed to brutally rip away another piece of that arrogant certainty. A prominent Swiss investor suddenly delayed a massive infrastructure project. A major hotel group in Chicago formally requested a comprehensive risk review, and an insurance giant in Washington froze the coverage of a massive contract that Liam had considered completely finalized. Liam stormed into his glass-walled office with heavy, furious steps, aggressively waving away his concerned secretary, and slammed the heavy door with enough force to make the adjacent glass partitions physically vibrate. The mysterious name Atlantic 5A continued flashing relentlessly on his mobile phone screen, directly linked to alarming financial reports that his executive team absolutely should have noticed weeks ago. He immediately called the senior lawyer responsible for his divorce and aggressively demanded to know if Isabella had somehow received any external copies of their classified internal documents. The lawyer sounded profoundly offended, insisting that Isabella had barely even asked for the required time to read the basic clauses before she signed everything away without a fight. This definitive answer, which logically should have brought him immense relief, only served to irritate Liam even more, because he could not shake the terrible feeling that his simple ex-wife had somehow understood the complex situation far better than his entire board of directors. He vividly remembered her haunting question from the night before, asking if he was absolutely sure he wanted to lose everything, and realized with a sinking stomach that it no longer sounded like a desperate threat, but rather a chillingly accurate warning. Rachel arrived shortly before noon, wearing an impeccable beige designer suit and a terribly expensive perfume that seemed to aggressively occupy the air before she even stepped fully into the room. Rachel entered Liam's office without knocking, carrying the entitled smile of someone who firmly believed she belonged there by divine right, and casually mentioned that her father thought it would be best to advance the public announcement of their corporate alliance. Liam observed her with a completely new level of attention, seeing far less social charm and much more cold calculation, as he pointed out that her father seemed to think a great many things lately. Rachel maintained her perfect smile, but her manicured fingers gripped the strap of her luxury handbag incredibly tight, as she accused Liam of being tense over a woman who always possessed a toxic talent for making him doubt his own greatness. While Liam was slowly discovering that his towering empire had left its doors wide open to invisible enemies, Isabella was waking up in a completely silent, sunlit suite, facing the cold ocean in the Hamptons. She had not slept a single minute, having spent the entire long night diligently reading complex financial reports, responding to encrypted messages, and glancing during cruel intervals at the faint lingering mark of the wedding ring on her finger. The grand Vanderbilt mansion did not possess the screaming, vulgar ostentation of the newly rich socialites in New York City. It was incredibly spacious, deeply historic, and fiercely protected by ancient gardens that rolled gently down to the private docks. Amelia, the deeply loyal housekeeper who had served the family since long before Isabella was even born, quietly entered the room carrying a silver tray and wearing a look of profound, careful concern. "You have not eaten a single bite since yesterday morning." Amelia scolded gently, prompting Isabella to close her encrypted laptop and softly reply that she had been quite busy ceasing to be a wife. Amelia placed the steaming coffee down and firmly stated that Isabella had never once ceased to be exactly who she truly was, causing Isabella to reach up and touch the ancient silver ring hidden on her necklace. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the powerful council of the Vanderbilt Atlantic Group was already fully assembled in the grand dining room, where massive arched windows allowed the ocean breeze to enter like a silent eternal witness. Alexander Vanderbilt, her formidable great-uncle and the ultimate guardian of the family's voting power, watched his brilliant great-niece with a complex mixture of immense pride and deep, lingering worry. Alexander Vanderbilt was an incredibly elegant, slender man, with snow-white hair and the calculating eyes of a veteran who had successfully survived countless decades of treacherous corporate warfare and broken alliances. You explicitly requested to maintain a defensive position regarding the impending collapse of Montgomery Global, Alexander stated, clasping his weathered hands together and noting that many people at the table considered her hesitation to be foolishly sentimental. Charles, a much younger and vastly more aggressive board member, leaned forward and bluntly stated that Liam had publicly humiliated her, meaning the only logical reaction was to let the unforgiving market completely destroy his company. Isabella did not look away for a single second, calmly replying that the most logical reaction was very rarely the most correct or strategic reaction in the grand scheme of things. Charles let out a completely humorless laugh, sarcastically apologizing, but reminding Isabella that their historic family did not become billionaires by actively protecting ungrateful, arrogant men who cast them aside. Isabella slowly opened a thick leather folder and smoothly slid several highly classified documents across the polished wooden table, declaring that their family achieved greatness because they knew how to distinguish petty revenge from long-term strategy. She explained that the immediate uncontrolled collapse of Montgomery Global would completely devastate countless innocent suppliers, thousands of hard-working employees, unfinished infrastructure projects, and entire vulnerable communities that heavily depended on their payroll. I am absolutely not going to blindly set a massive city on fire merely to warm my own bruised pride, she declared, firmly establishing her ultimate authority over the room. The heated discussion grew louder, but absolutely no one dared to disrespect her, because the young woman who had hidden herself away years ago now occupied the highest chair, proving the Vanderbilt name was never just a decorative title. Still hidden deep inside her chest, there was a terrible aching crack that absolutely no one else in the room could see, because she desperately wanted to hate Liam with simple, uncomplicated ease. She wanted to only remember the cruel pen resting on Catherine's table, but her treacherous heart kept remembering Liam sleeping in a terrible plastic chair next to her hospital bed when a violent fever struck her during their first year of marriage. She remembered his warm hand enveloping hers in the dark corridor, and his vulnerable voice confessing his deep terror of trusting someone only to discover he was being used for his wealth. Alexander waited patiently for the younger men to finish their aggressive posturing before softly asking Isabella what exactly she intended to do with the massive debt portfolio they had recently acquired. Isabella took a very deep breath, looking out at the crashing gray waves of the ocean, and firmly commanded them to hold the debt and absolutely refrain from executing any hostile takeovers just yet. When Charles angrily demanded to know her ultimate plan, she replied that they would give Liam just enough time to discover exactly who was standing next to him, but not enough time to completely destroy everyone else, while stubbornly trying to prove he was right. Back in New York City, Liam urgently summoned Aaron Norton back into his office and demanded an absolutely complete, unfiltered list of all internal financial movements from the last 6 months. The financial director arrived looking completely exhausted, carrying dark bags under his eyes, and placed a thick sequence of previously ignored risk assessment reports directly in front of his furious boss. Liam rapidly flipped through the dense pages until he suddenly recognized a series of highly precise annotations, written in a sophisticated financial language that definitely did not belong to anyone on his current risk management team. The notes contained incredibly accurate observations regarding the excessive collateral guarantees, the dangerous acceleration clauses, and the toxic dependency on Alden Capital that now threatened to completely sink his entire company. When Liam aggressively demanded to know who had written these brilliant warnings, Aaron nervously tightened his lips and confessed that the documents had originated from emails forwarded directly from Liam's own house. Your former wife specifically requested that these warnings be thoroughly evaluated before you signed the preliminary agreements with the Alden family. Aaron whispered, causing Liam to slowly raise his eyes in absolute paralyzing shock. My ex-wife. Liam automatically corrected, though the bitter taste of the word burned his throat, as Aaron shamefully admitted he had completely discarded the reports because he assumed it was just annoying domestic interference. The heavy silence in the office suddenly turned into a sharp, unforgiving blade, and Liam stood up so violently that his heavy leather chair nearly tipped over backwards onto the floor. He demanded to know if Aaron was seriously telling him that Isabella had perfectly identified the exact catastrophic risk that was currently destroying them, and absolutely no one had bothered to inform him. Aaron grew deathly pale, quietly, stating that they had all severely underestimated the absolute wrong person, a haunting phrase that relentlessly pursued Liam for the entire remainder of the miserable afternoon. Liam desperately tried to call Isabella's mobile phone once, and then tried again, but the urgent calls went straight to her automated voicemail, and his lingering pride prevented him from leaving a message. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Catherine called him with her perfectly controlled, authoritative voice, firmly instructing him not to let himself be emotionally manipulated by his ex-wife's pathetic attempts for attention. Liam stared out the massive window at the gray city and quietly replied that his greatest weakness was foolishly believing everyone else in his life, except the one woman who actually cared. Catherine warned him that guilt was a terrible counselor, to which Liam sharply retorted by asking what she called prejudice, prompting his mother to angrily hang up the phone without another word. That tiny, almost invisible rupture with his controlling mother was honestly more terrifying than a massive shouting match, because Liam realized he was no longer just investigating a mysterious financial fund, he was investigating his own family. Rachel did not accept his earlier rejection with any grace. That evening, she suddenly appeared in the private underground garage of Montgomery Global, blocking his path with a fake smile. When Liam told her his family seemed to have suffered much less than they had lied, the dark shadow that crossed Rachel's face confirmed a terrible truth he was finally beginning to understand. Rachel's momentary lapse in composure in the dark garage spoke volumes, revealing the desperate panic of a woman whose entire, meticulously crafted reality was rapidly beginning to crumble under the weight of her own lies. She had arrogantly assumed that Isabella was merely a temporary, powerless obstacle, a pathetic nobody who could be easily bullied out of the picture with a few cruel words and a perfectly timed divorce. However, the sheer terror flashing in her eyes told Liam everything he needed to know about the fragile, rotting foundation of the Alden family empire, confirming that Rachel was hiding a massive financial catastrophe. Meanwhile, later that evening in the Hamptons, Isabella finally received the ultimate unredacted intelligence report detailing the true, horrifying extent of Alden Capital's catastrophic financial situation and their hidden liabilities. The comprehensive document was significantly worse than she had ever anticipated, exposing deeply masked debts, heavily compromised collateral, shady intermediary funds, and a crystal-clear, desperate attempt to use the Montgomery Global merger as a sacrificial lifeboat. It was not a simple corporate misunderstanding. It was the highly sophisticated desperation of a proud family that had already lost absolutely everything, but still desperately wanted to walk into high society ballrooms holding expensive champagne. Alexander found her sitting alone in the massive library, her beautiful face illuminated by the cruel glowing numbers on her screen, and gently pointed out that she could easily hand this dossier to the press tomorrow and utterly destroy Rachel. Isabella quietly closed the encrypted file, softly replying that while she certainly possessed the power to do so, She would absolutely not pull the trigger just yet. Alexander leaned heavily on his silver-handled cane, stating with a mixture of awe and frustration that she was still actively protecting the very man who had so coldly thrown her away. Isabella took a long time to answer, and when she finally spoke, her voice was incredibly low, explaining that she was protecting the beautiful things Liam had built before he transformed into the paranoid man who wounded her. The wise old patriarch observed her with a very severe yet profound compassion, asking the one question that truly mattered: who exactly was going to step up and protect Isabella? She looked down at the empty space on her finger, where her wedding band used to sit, firmly closed the empty jewelry box, and declared that from this moment forward, she would fiercely protect herself. Early the very next morning, Liam arrived at the corporate headquarters long before any of his staff and discovered a completely blank, unmarked envelope resting conspicuously in the exact center of his pristine desk. Inside the mysterious envelope, he found a single copy of a highly classified contractual page, heavily marked in bright red ink, accompanied by a typed unsigned note, instructing him to read it before announcing any alliances. He instantly recognized the obscure clause from the Alden Capital merger agreement, accompanied by a brilliant marginal note highlighting that in the event of credit instability, the absolute control of his assets would transfer to secondary guarantors. Liam felt his pulse accelerate to a dangerous speed as he loudly summoned Aaron into the room, aggressively throwing the marked page onto the table and demanding to know the true identities of these hidden guarantors. Aaron rapidly read the highlighted text, and his entire expression violently fell apart as he stuttered that if this anonymous analysis was correct, the merger would completely bury Montgomery Global underneath Alden's toxic debt. Before Liam could even formulate a proper response, a terrified senior board member rushed into the office without knocking, breathlessly announcing that the mysterious Atlantic 5A fund had just formally demanded an emergency in-person meeting. Liam stood perfectly still, asking if they wanted to meet with him personally, but the pale board member shook his head, clarifying that the shadowy fund had explicitly demanded to meet with the entire executive council. Liam stared intensely at the letters VVA on the document, and the sudden vivid memory of Isabella's strange signature on their divorce papers hit him like a brutal physical blow to the chest. For the very first time, he quietly pronounced the full terrifying name that absolutely no one had dared to say out loud the previous day, realizing that the simple world he had so arrogantly despised in Isabella was vastly larger than his ego. The emergency meeting with the Atlantic Fund began in the main boardroom with an intentionally empty leather chair placed at the absolute head of the table, an aggressive power play that irritated Liam more than a direct threat. The entire executive council of Montgomery Global had been nervously assembled since the early morning, all dressed in their most somber suits, desperately trying to hide their mounting panic beneath expensive silk ties and forced professionalism. The heavy mahogany doors finally swung open, and three sharp corporate consultants entered the room, accompanied by an older woman with striking gray hair, an impeccable posture, and eyes that were just as cold and calculating as Liam's. Margaret, a highly respected minor character newly appointed as the fund's senior proxy, did not show the slightest bit of intimidation, as she firmly stated that the fund did not come to ask for permission. She announced to the completely silent room that they had arrived solely to prevent Liam's prestigious company from being cowardly used as a disposable meat shield for a massive toxic debt that did not belong to them. Liam aggressively leaned forward, demanding to know who exactly had decided they needed this unsolicited protection, prompting Margaret to calmly open a thick leather folder and reply that it was someone who actually bothered to read the contracts. That sharp, elegant response hit Liam in the exact spot where his towering arrogance was most terribly exposed, forcing him to look away in profound shame as Margaret began distributing the undeniable proof of the Alden family's treachery. Margaret meticulously presented a devastating sequence of hidden cross guarantees, shady intermediary shell companies, and toxic financial commitments that directly linked Alden Capital to a series of ruthless vulture funds that were preparing to execute immediate collections. The irrefutable evidence was highly technical, but completely clear enough to terrify every single responsible executive in the room, proving beyond any doubt that Rachel had knowingly orchestrated a massive fraud to save her own family. When an outraged board member loudly demanded to know the identity of the fund's controlling shareholder, Margaret calmly closed her folder and replied that when the shareholder decided to introduce herself, everyone would understand why there were still chairs left to occupy. Liam felt his blood boil, not from the perceived insult, but because that specific, elegant phrasing carried the exact same cutting, quiet authority that Isabella had always possessed. Rachel discovered the disastrous outcome of the board meeting shortly before noon, when a terrified council member who had been secretly bought with promises of future favors called to warn her that Atlantic 5A was dismantling everything. She listened to the catastrophic news in the private velvet-lined dining room of a luxury hotel sitting directly across from her father, Edward Alden, a man who had aged decades in the past few months. Edward aggressively gripped his expensive crystal water glass, frantically whispering that their massive corporate debt was fully due in mere weeks, and without the Montgomery merger, they would face total, inescapable bankruptcy and public ruin. For the very first time in her pampered life, Rachel's flawlessly trained beauty completely vanished, replaced by a visceral, ugly terror of permanently disappearing from the elite social world that had taught her to value nothing but status. "You promised me that Liam would blindly sign the paperwork without asking any questions." Edward hissed, his bloodshot eyes darting around the empty room, to which Rachel bitterly replied that he would have signed if Isabella had not left warnings everywhere. Rachel took a deep, shaky breath, her mind racing with toxic strategies, and coldly decided that to properly destroy a silent, dignified woman, they needed to give her honorable silence a completely filthy public interpretation. By the late afternoon, the dirty smear campaign had aggressively launched, spreading like a vicious wildfire, first through private messaging groups of wealthy wives, and then exploding onto high-profile luxury gossip websites. The malicious articles strongly insinuated that Liam's ex-wife was secretly tied to a shady investor, that their marriage ended due to her hidden betrayals, and that the Atlantic Fund was merely a petty, intimate revenge plot. None of the cowardly articles provided a shred of actual proof, but they expertly suggested just enough scandalous details to completely ruin a reputation, and Liam saw the very first publication while riding his private elevator. The immediate impact was not jealousy, but a blazing, uncontrollable rage, because he instantly recognized Rachel's toxic, elegant signature behind the malicious rumors, and he violently hated that a tiny, insecure part of him almost wanted to believe it. He urgently called Isabella, and this time she surprisingly answered on the fourth ring, her voice icy, as she preemptively told him that if he was calling to ask if she had cheated, he should hang up the phone immediately. Liam tightly closed his eyes, his voice sounding far less like the master of the universe, and much more like a deeply lost, broken man, as he quietly confessed that he had called solely to make sure she was safe. Isabella was currently staying in a highly discreet hotel in the city, far away from the obvious glamour of the places the Montgomery family frequented, having traveled back for urgent meetings with her legal team. She stared out the window at the sprawling metropolis that had swallowed her in silence for 3 years, feeling a sharp pain, not from the public accusations, but from the tragic realization that Liam was still capable of doubting her. Liam took a deep breath, admitting that he had finally found the crucial financial reports she had sent, and acknowledging that Aaron had foolishly ignored them, while Catherine had actively interfered to suppress her brilliant warnings. Isabella closed her eyes for a brief moment, finding absolutely no victory in his delayed confession. Only a deep, exhausting sadness, as she softly replied that she had always known significantly more than he ever allowed her to say. Liam, gripping his phone with desperate strength, finally asked the burning question that had been torturing him for days, begging to know exactly who or what Atlantic 5A truly meant to her in the grand scheme of things. Isabella opened her eyes, staring at the cold city lights, and softly replied that it was perhaps the very first thing in her entire life that he could not simply by aggressively control or arrogantly despise. The heavy conversation ended abruptly without any formal goodbye, leaving Liam staring at a completely dark screen, feeling as though she had taken the last, simple, uncomplicated piece of their shared history away with her forever. That evening, he returned to the penthouse and found Catherine arrogantly supervising the replacement of Isabella's favorite flowers with sterile white orchids, a petty controlling gesture that instantly ignited a cold fury inside of his chest. Liam confronted his mother without any polite introductions, demanding to know why she had deliberately ordered Aaron to ignore Isabella's warnings, and Catherine defended herself by claiming she was protecting him from a woman who wanted unearned authority. She cruelly reminded him of his father's tragic destruction at the hands of a gold digger, claiming that women without a proper origin learn incredibly fast when they want to become indispensable to powerful men. Liam felt something fundamental permanently break inside his soul, and he firmly told her to stop stating that she had terribly taught him to disguise his paralyzing fear of intimacy as a form of superior intellectual lucidity. While Liam battled the ghosts of his childhood, Isabella faced a much quieter storm, firmly refusing Alexander's strong advice to publicly reveal her true identity to the press, to instantly crush the vicious rumors Rachel had started. Isabella sat at the massive oak table surrounded by top-tier corporate lawyers, and calmly explained that a premature announcement would only turn her life into a cheap spectacle, making her look like a woman using a surname to crush another. If I simply respond by bragging about my wealth, I will become exactly the kind of monster Rachel desperately wants me to be, she declared, gently touching the ancient Vanderbilt ring resting quietly on the table. Alexander argued that crushing one's enemies was sometimes an absolute necessity, noting that her grandfather only believed in showing mercy to people who actually possess the capacity for genuine shame, which the Alden family clearly lacked. Isabella decided they would simply let Rachel exaggerate her desperate lies a little longer, knowing that when the final trap was sprung, the absolute truth would destroy the Alden empire without requiring her to sacrifice her dignity. The very next morning, an anonymous dossier was deliberately sent to 3 key board members containing photographs of Isabella walking into a commercial building alongside Henry Vance, a highly prominent investor known for financing high-risk corporate operations. The photos were entirely real, but the malicious context was completely fabricated. Henry had worked loyally for the Vanderbilt Group for decades and was happily married to Isabella's cousin. But the captions heavily insinuated a secret, scandalous affair. When Liam saw the glossy photos, his ancient, terrible fear of betrayal roared to life. But then he noticed that Henry was carrying a folder bearing the exact same wave and stars symbol as Isabella's cherished pendant. He immediately summoned his chief corporate investigator aggressively, throwing the photos onto the desk, and demanded to know exactly who leaked them, stating he was finally done destroying his life based on paranoid, fabricated assumptions. The extraordinary board meeting was convened precisely at 6 o'clock in the evening, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the Montgomery Global Headquarters, with the singular purpose of permanently suspending the disastrous Alden announcement. Rachel arrived wearing a striking, dark red designer dress smiling with the manic confidence of someone desperately attempting to transform a looming tragedy into a grand theatrical stage where she still played the leading role. Catherine was also present in the room, and although she held absolutely no formal corporate title, her domineering presence was more than enough to silently remind everyone that true power in this family did not always sign the meeting minutes. Isabella arrived exactly 10 minutes later, completely without any visible security escort, wearing a simple, elegant light suit, her hair neatly tied back, and carrying an expression of such profound tranquility that the entire atmosphere of the room instantly shifted. A retired banker who had previously ignored her existence entirely during countless shallow family dinners instinctively stood up and bowed his head slightly, as if recognizing a deep, ancient code of authority that he could not quite explain. Rachel immediately noticed the subtle sign of respect, and her fake smile hardened into a brittle mask as she loudly mocked the situation, sarcastically asking since when the discarded ex-wife was allowed to participate in high-level corporate governance. Isabella calmly walked to the opposite end of the massive table, completely ignoring the blatant insult, and firmly stated that when a massive lie attempts to become the official record, someone must humbly ask for the floor to speak the truth. Liam felt his heart hammer violently against his ribs, realizing that the commanding aura she projected was not born of anger or spite, but was an inherent authority she had always possessed, which he had foolishly mistaken for mere obedience. The meeting began in a state of open, suffocating tension, as Rachel rapidly launched into her rehearsed narrative before the corporate lawyers could even begin to properly organize their massive stacks of printed financial documents. She aggressively insinuated that Isabella had maliciously manipulated confidential marital information, utilized intimate contacts to illegally interfere with the company, and was currently attempting to execute a petty, vindictive revenge plot because of the recent divorce. Isabella did not interrupt a single word. She simply waited in total silence, and this incredible display of infinite patience seemed to irritate Rachel far more than any loud defensive screaming ever could have done. Rachel dramatically opened a folder and violently threw the stolen photographs of Isabella and Henry Vance right into the center of the table, loudly demanding that Isabella explain her secret. Scandalous meetings to the entire stunned board. During the board meeting, Isabella exposed Rachel's deception by proving that the photographs were real, but the accusations were fabricated to save her collapsing family. She then revealed her true identity as Isabella Helena Vanderbilt, majority heir of Vanderbilt Atlantic and controlling shareholder of the fund that owned the company, shocking everyone, especially Liam. The evidence showed that she had secretly acquired the company's debt only to protect it from Alden Capital's toxic liabilities, never intending to harm Liam despite having the power to do so. Further documents uncovered illegal loans and fraudulent financial schemes involving Rachel's family, while Rachel admitted she had used Liam to shield her family's downfall. Isabella confronted Catherine and Liam with the painful truth that they had judged and controlled her, because she chose not to rely on her family name, leading Liam to realize he had destroyed their marriage through fear, distrust, and pride. The merger was immediately suspended. An independent audit was ordered, and Isabella left the executives to face the consequences of their actions. Afterward, Liam resigned. Pending the audit, publicly accepted responsibility for his failures and refused to exploit Isabella's role for public sympathy. He wrote her a sincere letter, sought professional therapy, and gradually learned accountability instead of excuses. Rachel left the country, Catherine eventually acknowledged her injustice, and Isabella officially assumed leadership of Vanderbilt Atlantic while embracing her true identity. A year after their divorce, Liam approached Isabella with humility, rather than demands admitting his past mistakes, and asking only for the chance to begin again. She made it clear that trust could not be rebuilt on fear alone, but accepted a simple coffee invitation. And together they realized that genuine love and lasting relationships are founded not on wealth status or pride, but on honesty, vulnerability, forgiveness, and the willingness to learn from painful mistakes and start over with mutual respect.